This is Nerd World Problems, things that matter to awesome people. I like The Two Doctors. It's a nice bit of fun and nostalgia with some great location work, a classic monster, and some really deep themes. However, I wasn't born when it first aired. The Two Doctors as a concept is a really risky move. Producing it in Colin's first year as the Doctor and bringing in a previous incarnation potentially undermines his position as the current actor in the eyes of the audience, especially when under criticism. It would be the classic series equivalent of bringing in Peter Capaldi's successor and then putting in David Tennant halfway through the season. It's surprising that Colin didn't object to this, but he is after all a professional, and he was really fond of Patrick Troughton. The reasons for the Two Doctors' conception are pretty flimsy and next to non-existent. The story goes that during the Five Doctors, Patrick Troughton and J&T had gotten on well, and Pat had been open to the idea of making an appearance in future. John Pertwee had also done the same, but that never went anywhere. Multi-Doctor stories had always been, up to this point, a concept reserved for special occasions and celebrations. What the Two Doctors runs the risk of is normalising it. Occurring little over a year after the Five Doctors, the Two Doctors feels a bit like just because. This is the thing that happens. It's also really odd that the Doctor chosen to appear is the second Doctor from 20 years ago that most kids at the time wouldn't have even been aware of. So that kind of raises the question of who this show is actually aimed at. On to more positive things. In the Two Doctors' defence, it actually does something really different with the multi-Doctor format. Rather than all the Doctors being drawn into one place by some contrived means, this is partially a purely coincidental meeting and partially interference in the Doctor's own past. For the most part, the Doctors are kept separated up until the final act of the story. Speaking of which, this story is a whopping 3 45-minute parts long, which is the equivalent to a usual 6-parter. Last time we had one of those was the Armageddon Factor, back in the Tom Baker era, so in this era, it does feel at times like a bit of a slog having to sit through 3 double-length episodes, and the pacing isn't great. Cut down by an episode, this could have improved the pacing and made it thoroughly entertaining. But that's not to say it isn't in its current form. Wisely, the adopted format is to have a linking 2-parter and 4-parter, albeit in the double-length 45-minute format. So part 1 takes place almost entirely on the space station, back to 80s BBC Sci-Fi. Then the following parts take place in Spain, for no particular reason at all. That's not a criticism, just an observation, but hey, it's a welcome change of scenery. I think if you break it down, if the first part had been split into 2 parts, the 6th Doctor almost wouldn't appear in part 1. That could have been quite exciting and intriguing, having a standalone 2nd Doctor episode amongst the serial. It could have been played out exactly in a 60s style, and really put the audience on the back foot as to wondering what's going on here. Surprisingly, coming in the same season as Attack of the Cybermen, the story isn't bogged down in its own continuity. But it does something even more confusing instead. Instead, it creates its own new continuity for the 2nd Doctor. There isn't much of it, but what we do here is in no way coherent to established history and quite contradictory, to the extent that it has generated a whole spin-off theory called Season 6B. The basic idea behind that is the 2nd Doctor's regeneration is halted partway through, and he's hired by the Celestial Intervention Agency to take on missions for them and has Jamie return to him with his memories intact. Whether this came from writer Robert Holmes or script editor Eric Saywood is anyone's guess, but I'd be really curious to find out whether this was deliberate or some kind of accident. Seeing Patrick Troughton share centre stage as the Doctor one last time is wonderful. It was never not going to be. Although it is odd, however, to see how an early Doctor fits into 80s Doctor Who, especially in a co-leading role. I know we've seen multi-Doctor stories before, but that's always been a more of an ensemble affair. Here, they are 2 co-leads, and the 2nd Doctor takes much more of a leading role. I'm not saying Patrick Troughton plays the role better than Colin Baker. Patrick Troughton created a character over 3 years and then adapted it for subsequent guest appearances. Plus, he's already been established and therefore has something of an upper hand. Colin has been at it for a matter of months. The differences are striking though. Troughton confidently leads, stepping back into the role like a pair of old hush puppies. With the 6th Doctor, the entire production team are still experimenting and developing the character. Fraser Hines too very competently reprises the role of Jamie, acting his way out of swathes of tartan in 90-degree heat. It's quite alarming how he doesn't appear to have aged that much. Jamie and the Doctor's chemistry works brilliantly throughout most of the first episode, as it always has done. It's just a shame that they're separated very early on. However, this does open up the way for Jamie to effectively become a temporary companion for the Sixth Doctor, which actually works really well, and it feels like we have a functioning TARDIS team for once. This additional element is perhaps what the Doctor and Peri needed earlier. Really, what the Doctor and Peri relationship needs is a second companion, an intermediary for Peri to open up to, and as a surrogate for the audience. That is one thing that Series 8 of the new series did quite well, in that Clara, having had her faith in the Doctor shaken by his dramatic change in character, ends up using Danny Pink as a sounding board for her inner feelings, which contextualises her actions. She has someone that she can trust, can open up to, and who understands her on a human level. The only time we see that in the Sixth Doctor's era is in the Two Doctors with Jamie. His very presence tempers the crew, and he brings a bit of much-needed humour and joviality to the TARDIS, which helps offset the darker elements of the story. It's a real shame that Fraser Hines couldn't have stayed longer. The Doctor and Peri continue their more subdued relationship here, but there are a few rough edges still. At one point you can actually see Peri mime calling the Doctor an arsehole. By this point we have reached something of an equilibrium, but as welcome as Jamie's presence is, it does make it hard to judge their relationship in its own right. As for the themes of this story, it's probably on par with Vengeance of Varos in terms of just how shady it is, but not so on the nose. The blazing sunshine of Spain and comedy eyebrows disguise the fact that this story looks at, amongst other themes, playing God, genetic modification, selective breeding and eugenics, caste systems, cannibalism, animal cruelty, racism, sexism, segregation, militarization of scientific advancement, rape, predatory instinct, insurrection, political conspiracy, betrayal, gluttony, and greed. The script also features Sontarans being dissolved by acid and the Doctor suffocating Shockeye with cyanide. Jesus, who wrote this script? Oh, it was Robert Holmes. Yeah, it all makes sense. Now, the cyanide bit is what everyone remembers about this story, just like the acid bath in Vengeance on Varos. And it's largely the same problem. Shockeye has spent a whole 3 episodes trying to eat anyone and anything, including the Doctor, Peri, and Jamie. Prior to his downfall, he stabs the Doctor in the leg, seriously injuring him, and he then chases him into the hills. The Doctor is physically compromised, and we have seen what Shockeye is capable of, and John Stratton portrays this so brilliantly when it could have been so ridiculous. If the Doctor gets caught, he will be killed and served up with garnish. He covers Shockeye in a net and uses cyanide to neutralise him. It is again another darkly humorous quip that some viewers interpret as the Doctor having found this amusing. This again was more likely to diffuse the very grim tone for the kids. Misjudged? Maybe. The main guest star, apart from Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines, was Jacqueline Pearce as Cassini. Being famous for her role as Servalan in Blake 7, she's a great choice for a villain. I word that specifically in that she isn't a female villain, she is just an out-and-out villain, to the point where her gender is purely incidental. The Rani was a great female villain, but Cassini was just out-and-out bad. An out-and-out bad person who is credible, strong, and as ruthless as she needs to be to succeed, and she knows it. She isn't trying to prove anything because she's a woman. She has, by her own admission, been elevated beyond such primitive desires. She isn't insecure at all, she just wants what she wants. More like this, please. A superb character and a superb performance, considering Jacqueline Pearce was a last-minute replacement for another actress. Again though, The Two Doctors has a lot going for it in terms of its locations, cast and themes. The one thing that is absent is really an intriguing plot to string it all together. Whether it was diluted across the 3 episodes or lost amongst the many prescribed elements that John Nathan Turner gave Robert Holmes, or just not all that interesting to begin with, is unclear. So whilst it's very enjoyable to watch back in retrospect, at the time it must have struggled to hold the attention of its audience. I hope you've enjoyed this episode-by-episode analysis of the Sixth Doctor. Please let me know your thoughts about the character in the comment section below, and if you want to see more videos like this. In the meantime, please check out my blog, Nerd World Problems, at drtripod.wordpress.com, where you can find typed up versions of each of these episodes.